On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex talks with Miguel Conner about his book, Voices of Gnosticism, and his podcast, Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
Isn't Gnosticism limited in the same way Christianity's limited by this kind of always looking in the rearview mirror for the next archaeological dig to tell us who we are?
Yeah, it certainly is, but it really goes beyond history. There's sort of a binary code within man, and this binary code will always go off, and you have orthodoxy on one side, making things mainstream, believing that the world is going to be fine and that we're a part of this grand history of providence. There's also the other switch, the other side that's always there. You know, we are alienated. We are trapped in this world. There's something wrong with this world. That is why there are many writers and thinkers, again, like Carl Jung and others, who, for the Nag Hammadi Library, were getting some of the Gnostic ideas, even with the little information out there. This orthodoxy and Gnosticism is within each one of us. That's why it keeps resurfacing in so many different traditions.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode, we're going to talk to Miguel Conner, the host of a podcast that delves into Gnosticism. Now, you may have noticed that I've interviewed several podcast hosts over the last few months, and the reason for that is that I think something special happens when somebody spends a few years on a narrow little topic, interviewing all the experts related to that topic. So I'm always drawn to these hosts like Miguel who've explored other areas that are somewhat tangential to the topics that I've meandered into. I've really enjoyed listening to Miguel Conner's podcast. I've learned a lot from some of the excellent guests that he's had on. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to invite him on Skeptiko and see if we could explore this strange world of Gnosticism. Here's my dialogue with Miguel Conner. Today we welcome Miguel Conner to Skeptiko. As host of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio and author of the critically acclaimed Voices of Gnosticism, Miguel is one of the leading voices of this Gnostic movement that we seem to keep hearing so much about. And I also should mention that Miguel is also an accomplished fiction writer, having penned several popular post-apocalyptic, that's a hard one to spit out.
I always do that one too. Always, yeah.
But he's got some really cool vampire novels that have really caught the attention of a lot of people. So, Miguel, it's great to welcome you to Skeptiko.
I'm glad to be here, Alex. Thank you for having me on.
You know, and I should mention we tried to do this a week ago and we ran into some Skype trouble, so we're going to do it again. And in that intervening week, I've dug into even more of your shows, and I just keep wanting to dig more and more. You have such a great insight into this fascinating area of knowledge that is Gnosticism, and you weave it into our modern culture and modern contemporary issues in such an imaginative, creative, and entertaining way that I just really wanted to get you on and encourage people to check out Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I can live up to that billing, but I'll try.
Oh, I think you can, because I tell you what I wanted to do to tee this thing off was I want to give people a little taste for what you do, because it's really quite unique, and it's a very high-quality production that you put on your podcast, and it weaves together a lot of these elements. I'm going to play for folks an extended clip from one of your shows, and then let's jump in and talk about Gnosticism.
Let's do it.
Discover the mystery that works for you and only you. Before Jehovah and his archons start a joke and starts your whole internal world crying. For good this time. Like Joseph Campbell once said, there is nothing worse than reaching the top of the ladder, only to find out you are on the wrong wall. And often we trust the snakes rather than the ladders in this game of corporate and establishment thrones.
What would you do if you were stuck in one place? and every day was exactly the same, and nothing that you did mattered.
Now that sums it up for me.
It's not an easy task, finding out who you are and the mystery that works for you. But you're in good company with all the heretics here at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. After all, you spent most of your existences throughout creation as someone other than you, an organic machine or undead vessel for the vagaries of hating angels. Like Oscar Wilde said, most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions. Their lives a mimicry. Their passions a quotation. So it's time to find out, even though most of what you are is nothing. Phantom and digital numbers in the black screen of mere being. But with that tiny fragment of divinity within you that is larger than any binary universe and brighter than any cosmic architect's dream.
Do you know what crazy is? Crazy is majority rules. Yeah,
I know who I am.
We're certainly about gaining all of this through learning about Gnosticism.
So, Miguel, now that we've all been introduced to Aeon Byte, we can step back and talk about what is Gnosticism. But what I thought I'd share and get you to comment on as a way of kicking us off here is the Wikipedia definition of Gnosticism. And it says, Gnosticism is the dualistic belief that the material world should be shunned and the spiritual world should be embraced. And it goes on to say Gnostic ideas influence many ancient religions, and it also says that it advocates philanthropy, sexual abstinence, maybe even, and it also, of course, tells us that it's often associated with early Christianity. So in usual wiki fashion, they've probably left it out or maybe totally lost it, but tell us how close that definition is and what are some of the points that it's hitting that are important to this thing we're calling Gnosticism.
Well, I think it's a good working definition. Obviously, if you were to define anything, Christianity, Buddhism, and you threw in a few sentences here and there, it would work, but ultimately it's just the beginning of the journey. I like to see Gnosticism as more of an attitude, which basically centers around gnosis, that sort of insight into the other realms, into the divine realm or hellish realm, as well as an inner voyage into yourself. And it's not so much, it's knowing about the truth, but it's also breaking away all the falsehoods of existence around you. And the Gnostics would posit that these existences, that most of reality and unreality is really fake and false. And there are grains or divine sparks, ultimate truth that are out there. And it is our job to sort of gather these sparks, as the Kabbalists would call it, the tikkun olam, and send these sparks to a unification or a higher plane of existence. And I'm sort of getting metaphysical, but you can translate this sort of Gnostic sensibility to literature, whether it's Herman Melville or art in the movie The Matrix, or you can get philosophical as Aldous Huxley might, or Carl Jung in a psychological sense. And you can apply this sort of Gnostic sensibility to various facets or fields. And it really, to me, it's just very exciting. The idea of gnosis is any information that liberates you, that liberates your spirit or expands your consciousness. And that's what people propose, that Gnostics, even though they distrusted reality, I don't think they hated the world, but they certainly were full of skepticism for the world. And how are you going to find a way to liberate yourself from it? Some believe, yes, aesthetically, or you had to sort of deny the world. And if we are to believe some of the church fathers, there is some that believe you had to get sick of the world through libertine rituals, although we don't know for sure how credible these are. So in a sense, that is Gnosticism. And in fact, I'd like to, if you don't mind, read you what a friend of mine wrote, what I think he hit it on the nail, which is this.
Some conceive of Gnosticism as an ascetic and dualistic mysticism with a message of liberation from the present realm of suffering. Some conceive of Gnosticism as a mode of occult investigation and transformation of which sexual magic is a key component. Some conceive of Gnosticism as a pantheistic, world-embracing tradition with roots in nature-revering paganism. Some conceive of Gnosticism as a practical expression of Jungian psychology concept to which theology is extraneous. Some conceive of Gnosticism as a worldview rooted in the experience of alienation with a modern parallel in existentialism. Some take a combination of these paradigms and others beyond those that are listed. And I would say that the first and the last is probably a good, again, foundation, because after all, Gnosis begins like in the Matrix with taking that red pill, waking up and realizing, oh my God, there is something greater inside of me than I could ever thought, but also I'm living in the middle of a false reality, a construct, whether it's by governments, gods, people, or my own ego, and I have to get out of this. Another good Gnostic film would be The Truman Show.
That, I think, sums up so many of the both enticing aspects of Gnosticism and the challenging aspects of it as well, because let's throw in a couple other terms and ask for a definition of that. We have this term that pops up a lot called the Gnostic Gospels, and people always use air quotes when they talk about the Gnostic Gospels, but in real simple terms, so people have a grounding on this, what are we talking about when we talk about the Gnostic Gospels?
Yeah, traditionally, Alex, the Gnostic Gospels are the texts found in the Nag Hammadi library, not all of them, because the Nag Hammadi library is really kind of a greatest hits. It's got Jewish, Christian, pagan, and so Hermetic. But these are the writings found in the Nag Hammadi library, and outside of it, like the Pistis Sophia, probably include the Hermetic writings, some of the Kabbalah writings. But these, of course, posit and are couched in a sort of a Judeo-Christian world. And in this world, we have sort of a lesser creator God or divine agency that traps the divine spark in this, again, this sort of virtual reality, this illusionary hell, if you would. And through Gnosis, which is usually brought by a hierophant of mysteries, could be Jesus Christ, Hermes Trismegistos, Simon Magus, and so forth, Mary Magdalene, we can transform ourselves or wake up and find our journey back to our ancestral home. So these are sort of the qualities you'll find in the Gnostic Gospels. But having said that, I could say that, for example, Philip K. Dick's Valis is a Gnostic Gospel, or Herman Melville's Moby Dick is a Gnostic Gospel. I even say, The Matrix or The 13th Floor is a Gnostic Gospel. But I'm kind of extending this into other fields like literary, philosophical, and so forth.
There you go again, Miguel. We're going to have to keep pinning you down. That's wonderful. And I think it's wonderful in a brain-shifting kind of way that connects us with these very ancient texts and makes them more relevant to what we're doing. But I do want to try and pin down that history a little bit so we can just, again, ground people. So this is the mid-20th century. Isn't it the 1950s that the Nag Hammadi library is discovered, a lot of this stuff?
Yes, and the Gnostic Gospel would specifically be 2nd century Christian heresies that, again, talk about a demiurge, inner transformation of the self, possible reincarnation. Again, Jesus Christ is one of the leading figures. And from those texts, which were written by some believe these school of thoughts called the Sethians or the Valentinians, possibly the Cainites and Ophites, the serpent worshippers, from there you can start working your way out. But if you, in a scholarly way, Gnostic Gospels or even the Gnostics would be these 2nd century groups. In fact, many scholars today don't even use the term Gnosticism because, after all, it was coined in the 7th century by an Orthodox theologian, and it was originally a polemical term that kind of got expanded, like paganism. It grew into anything people didn't like. So I would start there and then work your way out.
So 1950s, we discover all these very early...
1945, yes.
I'm sorry. Okay. Great. 1945.
Right. And before that, there were some texts like the Pistis Sophia, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, floating around. But
okay, great. And these are heretical in the very true definition of the word, heretical to Christianity.
That's another problem, yes. The term heretical originally wasn't as negative as we know today. Like Irenaeus and some of the church fathers, the term heretical first really meant a school of thought. Like Josephus said, I'm a heretic of the doctors. He was a school of thought of the doctors. Then the term, which comes from the Greek for to make a choice, became in the 2nd and 3rd century simply a term for those Christians who had made a choice beyond the norm. They were on the fringe. Mm-hmm. And then it just gets worse and worse. Mm-hmm. But they are heretical, yes.
Okay, so when the 1940s rolls around and we discover these texts that are very, very much in conflict with, really, you cannot say another way, they're in direct conflict with the way the Judeo-Christian tradition has been westernized and the way that it's practiced. So this starts developing, would you say, this spark among certain people to say, wow, maybe even in our Western tradition we can find this, something that is we normally have thought of as more Eastern in its philosophical outlook. Let me just stop right there because I may have said something else that isn't correct. What are the ties between this early Christian Gnosticism and some of the Eastern traditions?
Well, the ties probably have always been there. I mean, we do know that there's always been, from the Silk Road, a trade of Eastern and Western traditions. Even, before the Gnostics, before Christianity, there was a Buddhist priests or monks in Alexandria before the 1st century going there. There were Romans going there for spices. So these ideas were back and forth. I mean, you look at something like a big influence on the Gnostic would be the cult of Orpheus that believed in reincarnation and a divine spark. The cult of Pythagoras. So this thing was in the air, and in fact, some scholars have said, hey, it's very possible that the Syrian mystics and the Gnostics actually influenced the East, some of the later traditions of Hinduism and some of the ideas of Buddhism. So the relation in a more primordial manner, and I must say that when the Gnostics were around, the other Christians around them shared a lot of these ideas. It wasn't anything heretical. This is sort of later when you had to sort of make these religions mainstream and marketable. But again, this idea that we have an inner God within us, each one of us, that we can access through the right rituals or contemplations, the idea again of reincarnation, the idea of insight into the world and how the world is simply an illusion that we have to break through. These were shared again by the Gnostics and the Easterners and even many of the Christian and Jews. It was not heretical or even controversial at the time. I mean, it was in the air across the world.
Yeah, and that again gets to one of the problems with Gnosticism as we try and define it, because as you just described, to a certain extent, it's defined by the religious structures that it kind of undermines. I mean, Gnosticism is to a certain extent defined by the Judeo-Christian tradition, when in fact the history of Gnosticism suggests that the Judeo-Christian tradition isn't what we have come to believe that it is, right? I mean, isn't there kind of a paradox there?
Yeah. I mean, there were, as scholars have said, including Elaine Pagels and so forth, there was no original Christianity in the 1st, 2nd, or even the 3rd century. It was all just this giant speculation of ideas and different little schools of thought that, congregated here and there and exchanged information with the pagans and the Jews in Alexandria and so forth. There was nothing ever said. I mean, for example, one of the great Orthodox fathers, Clement of Alexandria, said that only true Christian is a Gnostic, one who knows, one who has gnosis. Other church fathers, yes, said there is a demiurge. This world is divided by these sort of demons or archons, as they call them. So yes, you can easily say that there was never a sort of this sort of a formalized, organized Christianity that went out with the apostles and so forth. It was a very speculative and imaginative time, those early days of Christians, and the Gnostics were part of that group.
And then following that path forward, that Gnostic path forward, how do we differentiate that from modern ideas of enlightenment or awakening?
Well, the main difference, again, is that our world is created by lesser agencies or even evil agencies, which you really don't find anywhere. In fact, some Gnostics said that we as humans were simply sort of fleshy cases in which the divine spark was hidden from the true God or the higher forces like Sophia. So that right there is pretty much unique. And then the idea of gnosis is, I mean, all traditions have, would like to say, well, I can know God or I can experience God and have a mystic thing. And of course, that's great. To the Gnostics, it was more of it was an intellectual exercise, but also spiritual exercise. And it was a very in-depth going into the various levels of who you were as a human to find this divine spark. Even Carl Jung said the Gnostics were the original depth psychologists because they went deeper than pretty much any of the Greeks or philosophers out there. And then it was an outer ride into the different planes of reality or consciousness, which you don't find in any size or depth as you do with the Gnostics. So that right there, you're getting into sort of some very unique characteristics. But of course, as you said, no religion exists in a vacuum. Every religion exists in a state of hybridity where they borrow, take, and and interact with other religions until they all overlapped, and they all continue to overlap even to this day.
Interesting. Hey, another thing I want to get out there, because you just touched on it again, and that's this reference to the dark side, to the occult, to evil in its different forms as we think about it. And I think there's an association that a lot of folks have between Gnosticism and the occult and dark forces, dark elements. I think you've done a nice job already of showing us how those distinctions might not be exactly what we've been conditioned to think they are, but can you maybe touch on that some more?
Yeah, part of the gnosis, and of course this is why Gnosticism or the Gnostics have always been so endearing to so many artists. Throughout history, we can go through William Blake and Philip K. Dick and a whole slew of others. You're almost going to hit that Gnostic sensibility because it does begin by taking the red pill, and well, before you take the red pill, and you do feel an alienation. Like Morpheus said, there's something wrong in the world, but you don't know what it is, and it's like a splinter in your mind driving you mad. You feel alienated, like something is wrong. And I think more and more people in this society, with the media and everything that's going on, probably feel that way, and they did in the Roman times. And it starts with that alienation and that search for the truth, for reality. And as you seek that reality, you take the red pill, you realize that everything that you were taught or you believed is probably wrong, and everything that you are is really a construct of fate, of society, of dark, shadowy forces. The man behind the curtain. But at the same time, there's this beauty. You see this again. You see how the universe is really, there's this light hidden in all the universe, and beyond that, there's what they call the call of Sophia. There is the Gnostics call them the alien God, which is this force beyond all forces that calls you to it. But of course, you have to do the work and meet these beings halfway. So in that way, that's why maybe not just artists but occultists have felt so drawn to Gnosticism, because it's that sense of alienation, that sort of skepticism to the world, that artistic impulse to go out and find something that's better than what has been presented to us. And I mean, some people have called the Gnostics the original geeks or the original conspiracy theorists, because they were asking these questions long before everybody. They were asking, they thought there was a conspiracy in every rock and every human, and they wanted to analyze it, break down with it, and at the same time have enough compassion to show others to find their own inner light.
But what about that connection with the dark side? How do we dance in the shadows? And is Gnosticism one foot on the banana peel away from Satanism, like a lot of people will tell you it is?
Yeah, well, Satanism itself is, again, it's like paganism or not. It's sort of an umbrella term you throw here and that.
It's a very recent term, too. I mean, really, if we're going to be historical.
Right. I mean, if you read history, there have been, strange people who sacrificed make blood sacrifice for Satan, but they're still within the Christian mythology as much as they like to. They're
right.
still in the narrative,
Right.
so they're just Christians gone wrong or something. but with the Gnosticism, of course, the idea of gnosis is first the old Oracle of Delphi. A saying, know thyself. And to know thyself is not just to sit there and go, oh, I'm a beautiful snowflake, I'm a piece of God. Or, no, it's knowing that you are also made of some very dark forces. If Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you, well, logically, the kingdom of hell is within you. And most of what you are, again, is probably a construct of fate, of society, of, cosmic forces, stars. And you have to know this dark side as you have to know the dark side of the world. But in knowing it, you will hopefully find the answers on how to break out from it. But so again, it really starts with knowing thyself.
So, Miguel, you really do a masterful job on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio of weaving these threads of Gnosticism into our modern culture, and you've just done a nice job of doing it here. I do feel also, though, that you're open, as you describe on the show, to the limits of history. And we understand that history is written by those who conquer. And we have to wonder if the Nag Hammadi Library would even be in existence if Genghis Khan took one turn or another and burned the library like he destroyed the greatest library in the world in Baghdad and burned it to the ground. I mean, what uncharted documents are left is what we're really basing a lot of this on. Isn't Gnosticism limited in the same way Christianity's limited by this kind of always looking in the rearview mirror for the next archaeological dig to tell us who we are? Isn't that an inherent limitation of this kind of historical-based knowing?
Yeah, it certainly is, but it really goes beyond history. I think the scholar Jan Culianu, who wrote the Tree of Gnosis, he said that there's sort of a binary code within man, and this binary code will always go off, and you have orthodoxy on one side, making things mainstream, believing that the world is going to be fine and that we're a part of this grand history of providence. But there's also the other switch, the other side that's always there. We are alienated. We are trapped in this world. There's something wrong with this world. Let's go on this inner voyage inside and outside of us. So, and, as he posited, you could just erase the Bible and the Nag Hammadi and every religion. And within 100 years, the binary code will go off and somebody will go, I am Orthodox. This is the way it is. And immediately somebody down the line will say, no, there is the Gnostic sensibility. This is the way it is. That is why there are many writers and thinkers, again, like Carl Jung and others who, before the Nag Hammadi Library, were getting some of the Gnostic ideas, the names, the concepts. They were getting it very well, even with the little information out there. So yes, we are limited by history, but again, I feel that the sort of this orthodoxy and Gnosticism is within each one of us. That's why it keeps resurfacing in so many different traditions, whether it's Buddhist or Muslim and so forth. It's there.
Excellent. More evidence that it is truly an innate spark in us, and maybe even I'd say a divine spark, as you said, that is almost, it serves as evidence that it is there and it is timeless. Fascinating. Let's talk for a minute about the other dark side, that is the atheist, because you on your show are very charitable to the atheists and give great praise where it's often due to folks like Bart Ehrman, biblical scholar, Robert Price, and others who have a view that I think counter to this basic idea of gnosis. How do you see the atheistic, materialistic worldview fitting into this larger picture of this divine spark?
Well, obviously I would be certainly against it. I mean, I do admire the parts of atheists that would say with the Gnostics, hey, use your reason. I mean, the Gnostics, even in their text, talk about how science and art and literature will free you. That's part of gnosis. That expands your consciousness. I do like the Gnostics and the atheists would share the idea of being free from mainstream religions and the grip of tyranny of governments and so forth. But at the same time, that's where we part the way, because the Gnostics, again, it's about the divine spark, and you can change divine spark to more modern terms. Consciousness, a great mystery that Sam Harris, one of the popes of atheism, says that's the one thing science and materialism has not figured out. They may say, well, around the corner we're about to discover, consciousness. We're going to discover the flying car or the God particle. But the truth is they won't. It's a great mystery. So in that sense, the idea of consciousness and the divine spark, and obviously atheism can be a little bit more, what's the term? Well, I'm going to say materialistic, but yeah, atheism sort of has a positive view of all that is material and all that we can see, and the Gnostic sensibility would certainly reject that and say, no, it's all a lie eventually. Ultimately, it's a lie, and very little is going to be true. So that's where they part ways.
Well said. But there's a great divide between atheism and, if we want to lump together spirituality in its broadest term in a big tent way and throw Gnosticism in there and all our religions in there and our New Age traditions in there, all that stuff, that's one big tent. And the folks on the outside of that tent are saying, no. Your experience is nothing. You are merely your brain. You are this materialism. You are this biological robot. Isn't that more of a divide than we're kind of letting on when we let these people into the tent?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to go sometimes with the, enemy of my enemy is my friend, and go from there and hopefully, try to find some common ground, because I would hope that most reasonable atheists just want to get along and go about their business, which is what the ancient Gnostics tried to do, and they've been wiped out throughout history. So the Gnostic, ethos would say, well, if we can find groups to get along, let's do it. Yes, they might think differently. I mean, we do agree that 99% of what we are is false or organic or an illusion. Well, we agree on that. Maybe we can agree on the mystery of consciousness.
Interesting. And maybe that's why New Agers get your ire so much. Do you want to maybe speak to what it is about the crystal crowd and the secret crowd that so riles you up often on your show?
Oh, boy, yes. I think I've gone on many rants and ravings, probably because I used to be a New Ager before I started reading the Gnostic Gospels, and I enjoyed it. But the problem I see is beyond, again, they fall into the same materialistic traps as do others, except sometimes worse, because you get calendars and, again, diets and books for everything that's New Agey. But it's the idea of how they confront suffering. And this is where they fall short, even shorter than atheists or theists, because somehow suffering is relegated over to away from the moral realms and simply put into a sort of pseudo-psychology state. And suddenly, suffering is just an illusion you don't have to worry about, and everything is about self-development, and everything's going to be okay. But they take it even more to the extreme than the Abrahamic religions, who at least want to address suffering in the world. And that's my big contention with so-called New Age. I remember, I think, when I truly left the New Age movement, I was reading a book by Gary Sukoff, and I'd really liked The Seat of the Soul, but I kept rereading it, and there was a passage where he said, well, if you see somebody on the street who's poor and hungry and, has no clothes, just remember, he has a karmic duty, so don't worry about him. He's got to fulfill his karmic duty. And that to me that goes against the Gnostics or the Christians or even atheists. You can't just relegate people to the powers of fate or karma or, the chain of being of the Neoplatonists. No, the first thing about being a human and finding your divinity is to help other human beings. It's just basic.
So it's the narcissism and the hypocrisy, I guess, that you rail against. So if you're going to be a hedonist, at least be a full-blown atheistic hedonist. Don't go halfway and call yourself a New Ager and really be a hedonist and behind all that. Speaking of New Age, I wanted to bring up Shirley Maclaine because I heard an interview with her the other day, and of course she's one of the original New Agers and had a lot to do with the New Age movement with her astral projection and all the rest of that stuff. But the quote that she gave, because she's obviously a famous movie star, was that they were pushing her, and she said, hey, you know what? We're all entertainers at the end of the day. That's what we do. That's what we do. That's our life mission for everyone, is to kind of entertain everyone else. And I thought that was particularly relevant to your show. You put a high production quality in your show. You obviously care about engaging your audience in a way that is entertaining. What part does that play for you in your own personal understanding of Gnosticism and Gnosis?
Well, I think Shirley Maclaine is actually being very insightful, because the truth is that, and most people forget this, but the Gnostics and even the first Christians were artists as much as they were theologians or mystics. After all, the idea that you have to express something that cannot be expressed, knowing the unknown, well, you got to put it in a way that people learn through allegory, mythology, a parable. Jesus was about parables because he knew nobody would get it. And many of these texts were never meant to be read because nobody read, but they were actually sang. They were used as poetry. Even Willis Barnstone, who's a great Shakespearean translator who's worked with Jorge Luis Borges, who's also another great Gnostic, he said that the Gnostics were, one of their characteristics is always being the greatest artists of their time. I mean, you can go to the Middle Ages with the Cathars. Their hymns were just gorgeous. You can look at the Manichaeans of the Middle Ages and before. They loved drawing and writing these great poetry. So these world-hating, existentialist, alienated Gnostics were beautiful, as she said, entertainers first. And there's nothing wrong with it, because you're expressing something that's so amazing. Best you can do is sing. With St. Francis of Assisi, most people don't know, he used to put on plays to describe every gospel in the little town. He would just do these amazing theater productions to do the Gospel of John or whatever. I mean, it's part of it. You've got the divine spark lights with you, and you know things are bad, so the best thing you do is do a little song and dance.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, this artistic thread that you're going down as a way of expressing this divine spark. Again, we'll keep using that term, because what I want to do is juxtapose that with science. I'm just wondering, what are some of your thoughts in terms of what role modern science can play in maybe helping us probe these questions in a new or different way? Because we are very much a scientific culture, along with being an atheistic culture. How might science play a role in moving this gnosis forward?
Well, obviously science plays a role. Again, I mentioned the Gnostics. There's the Valentinian Theodotus. He said science actually makes our faith stronger, because what's out there is out there. But the gnosis, the knowledge from Greek, also is about, how you might say, calibrating your brain, making your mind into a stronger antenna so that it can commune with the other antennas, the higher mind, or the nous, as the Hermetics called it. So science guides us, but art inspires us. And to me, that is gnosis. It's the beginning of the gnosis, the two pillars of gnosis, if you would.
Yeah, that's a great quote. Well, here's another quote, one from the Dalai Lama, that kind of takes it in a different direction and says, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but basically the idea was that all of the ideas that have been around for centuries within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition are open to verification by science. And if science was to prove that anything is false, then of course Buddhism would have to change, because Buddhism is after pursuit of the truth. So do we need to put this kind of science first sensibility out there, or is that consistent with Gnosticism?
Oh, of course it'd be consistent, because the Dalai Lama is right, because after all, in Buddhism, what are you looking for? You're looking for a higher, expanded state of consciousness, an emptiness within you of all the things that you are, so that itself, what is real, can flow through. And that goes right into what the Gnostics would say, get rid of everything that's false in you and let that divine spark, aka consciousness, expand until you reach that that silence, that ethereal, sublime state. So there's nothing wrong with that. And science it's a great help.
Miguel, you mentioned a minute ago that Gnosticism isn't dependent on a certain history, and that that divine spark will emerge and continue to emerge kind of no matter what path we fall down in history. Let me play devil's advocate if I could. Ray Kurzweil is a guy who's come up on your show, and he's come up on my show as well. Of course, he's the famous futurist who talks about singularity, that is, that point sometime in the future, in a future that we can really see advancing a lot faster than we could before, when technology will equal human intellect as we know it. And when that point is reached and then exceeded, that we will be in a whole new realm, one that we have never anticipated at any point in history, we've never experienced at any point previous, and that it will redefine who we are. What does Gnosticism have to say about this view of human consciousness merging with the machine, with the divine spark, if you will, merging with the machine? Any thoughts on that?
The problem I have with the singularity view and the proponents of them is that I think that it plays too much on sort of the apocalyptic mentality that's out there. When it sort of exploits a very true Gnostic idea that, hey, we are dissatisfied with ourselves. All of us are sort of sitting here in the desert of the average, in our cubicles, in our homes, in our families. And instead of looking inward to what is real right now, we sort of get caught on these possibilities, these hopes for a better world. I mean, the Mayan apocalypse craze is the last great example how Christians are always looking for the end of the world. In fact, there's a book by John Greer, Apocalypse Not, where he studies and he said people want something in the future, even if it's carnage and brimstone from heaven, because it gets them away from the mundane reality they are in now. And again, this singularity sort of plays on it, that we will in the future become gods or united with the machines or have these mechanical consciousness, instead of, again, focusing on where we are now and what is wrong now with ourselves. Again, taking that journey inward.
Great. Speaking of future, Miguel, tell us a little bit about what's going on with you in the future, what's coming up on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, and other projects you might have in the works.
Well, at this moment in time, I'm sort of status quo. I just keep trying to get these great guests, these midwifers of truth that come on. For example, I have a show on Freemasonry. I have another guest talking about the different sort of Gnostic churches, because they are out there. In the 19th century, we had there was sort of a Gnostic revival, and these churches started coming about, including, Crowley did his old Gnostic Mass and so forth. So there's still a lot of places and guests out there who are part of the Gnostic taproot. So I'm working on that. I've got another novel that I should be finishing for a publisher, and few nonfiction articles that I'm writing for different publications. So I'm just, again, I am in my own little corner of the universe like you are, and we're over here just trying to open some more doors so people can make their own choices and go on their own adventure to find their divine spark, their true selves, their higher selves. And we'll see what happens. I don't expect to change the world. I don't think the Gnostics did, but we can, help one light spark at a time, as a Kabbalist would say.
Well said. And let's hope that a few more folks can find their way over to your little corner of the universe by virtue of this show. And I certainly hope that people do check out Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. You're in for a great ride if you do. Not only great content, but great guests as well. I've become a regular listener and can't wait for the next episode. So it's been great having you on. Miguel, thanks again for joining me today on Skeptiko.
Thank you, Alex. It was great being here.
Thanks again to Miguel Connor for joining me today on Skeptiko. A couple of questions I might tee up from this interview. First, let's jump right into first century Gnosticism and first century Christianity and tackle this one. What are the implications of the Gnostic Gospels for modern-day Christianity? Now, I know most of you aren't into religion, but purely from a historical perspective, I think it's interesting to look back at this history that is now pretty well established. That is, that there were all these different sects centered around this historical figure of Jesus, or maybe several historical figures that were called Jesus, however you want to slice or dice that. But it's interesting that we now know there were all these different traditions in the first century that were practicing different rites, different rituals, had very different ideas about what all that meant, and they were all coexisting at this time, and yet it gets rolled into this very homogenized kind of Christianity that we have today. So from a historical perspective, I think that's fascinating, and I certainly think that even if you're an atheist and think that all religion is total crap, you have to acknowledge the enormous influence that this Christian tradition has had on our culture, on our world, so I think it's worth a look back. And the second question has to do with this Gnostic sensibility of alienation. And I think that's one thing that really sparks my interest in Gnosticism, because there's something that rings true to that for me, and that is this idea that this world is not really what it's about, and we are somehow alienated in some way that we can't fully put our finger on from this material world. And I think in this show, as we've explored the limits of materialism, both scientifically and culturally, it does force one to kind of step back and say, gee, if I'm not part of that materialism and that materialistic worldview, then what am I? And am I really on the outside looking in of all this? Are we meant to feel alienated from this world? So those are a couple of questions to mull over and maybe share with me or other listeners through the comment section of the Skeptiko website or on the forum. You can find both at skeptiko.com. That's skeptiko.com. You'll also find while you're there a link to our more than 200 previous shows and an email and a Facebook link to me, all sorts of other good stuff. We'll have a number of interesting shows coming up. Couple of them on the UFO topic, which I've really wanted to get into more and more, but I seem to be limited by these other side adventures that I can't resist going down. But I do want to return to that topic because I think understanding the reality of that is fundamental to all these other questions that we're asking. So just a warning that you're liable to get a good dose of that in the upcoming episodes. So that's what's coming up. I hope you'll stay with me for all of that, and I hope you'll tell your friends about Skeptiko and continue to blog and write about us like many of you do. It's always nice to hear from people who are discovering the show for the first time. Well, that's it for this episode of Skeptiko. Do take care, and bye for now.